Hello, everybody, and welcome back to section 2 of our public policy course. And in this subsection, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the policy environment with a focus on political culture. Okay? So, the first thing you have to know when it comes to the policy environment and political culture is it's all about context, right? We can't just look at decisions in a vacuum. We can't look at policies in a vacuum. We have to look at what else was happening at the time in the area, all those things. So one kind of thing we have to be worried about is geographic, right? Um, in the early days of the United States, when we were still only the 13 colonies, we were basically everybody in the country lives within a few hours of the Atlantic Ocean. Um, it was a very different context than the modern day United States, which stretches from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and plus Alaska, Hawaii, a few territories. Um, and then there's things like, prior to the late 19th century, oil deposits weren't really known about or cared about, but then we figured out how to use oil, and all of a sudden those geologic resources became really important. Same thing with, uranium and plutonium prior to the 1940s. So the geographic context can change over time, both as the country grows or maybe even shrinks, or as new kind of natural resources become important or known about. There's also demographic, environmental factors. How many people are there? Are they, relatively young, relatively old? As lifetimes become longer and longer, our population is aging more and more. What are the relative racial makeups of the people of the United States, both as a whole and in different areas of the country? That's all going to have an effect on this policy environment. There's the political and social context of the times. These change. They could be, there are very, very conservative areas of the United States. There are very, very liberal areas of the United States. There are areas where things like racism or sexism or transphobia or homophobia are higher and lower, and times in the country when they're higher and lower. And then, of course, there's the economic environment, right? So, our policies during the Great Depression were a lot different than they are during, say, the late 1990s .com boom, versus the Great Recession in 2008 versus the high employment times of 2024 when this is being recorded. So the economic context can have a lot of effect on policy, how policy works, what policies get passed or don't pass, etc., as do all of those factors. Now, one of the biggest kind of factors that go into whether policies are adopted or not, what kind of the options for policy are seen or are viable or not, is about political culture, right? And political culture refers to kind of the widely held beliefs and values that people have about government. And this is relatively static country to country or even state to state, but it does change over time, right? The political culture from 2024 is vastly different than the political culture of the 1960s or the 1930s or the 1790s, right? How we see our government, what values we have about what government should and shouldn't do, have vastly changed over those different periods of American history, as they do in every country. But there is a lot of kind of passing it down from generation to generation to generation as well. So one political scientist, Elazar, they kind of decided that there were three different kinds or different types of political cultures that have more or less power in different times and in different places. Even here within the United States, let alone from country to country to country, right? the three types of political culture as described by Elazar are the individualistic, the moralistic, and the traditionalistic. The individualistic, they see government as kind of a utilitarian tool that is there to kind of give the people what they want, but that usually kind of comes down to protecting the marketplace, enforcing contracts, allowing the capitalistic system to operate with a minimum of fuss, but with a minimum of cheating as well. The moralistic political culture is more about government as a service, right? It's government's job to advance the public interest. We want the government to do things more than just protecting capitalism in the marketplace. We want the government to come in and help people. They have the legal authority and the economic capital to actually do things to help the people and the country as a whole. So we want the government to come in and do that. And then, of course, there's the traditionalistic. And this is where they see the government as kind of this paternal protector of the existing kind of social order. And it's the government's job to make sure that this social order is maintained and continues and goes on, and doesn't change too much of the way things are working now, because the way things are working now is great and we want to kind of maintain that. Now, Deutsch had another way of looking at political culture, and instead of individualistic and moralistic and paternalistic, Deutsch saw it more as a focus on the past, the present, or the future. Is your political culture primarily focused on the past and your history and, kind of, a past-focused political culture might focus more on things like Social Security and Medicare, and making sure that we preserve historical monuments and kind of focus on how things used to be. Whereas a future-focused society might look more towards, higher education and programs to help children and positive change to make things better as the country moves forward in time, right? Now, Almond and Verba, these two described political culture as kind of how the individual citizen sees their government and their government's job, right? And they said there were three kinds: the parochial, the subject, and the participant. And the parochial is a person who kind of doesn't care about the government. They don't expect anything from the government. They don't want anything from the government. The government doesn't have much impact on their day-to-day life. So they just kind of ignore governments and government processes. A subject political culture is one that focuses on outputs. What is the government doing, good or bad, right? So any attention they pay to the government is all about kind of how is this affecting me or the people around me or my neighborhood or my city or whatever. The participant political culture focuses on not just the outputs, but also the inputs. What can I do to kind of affect what my government does? Can I be an advocate for this policy or that policy? Can I call my congressperson? Can I, how should I vote on this representative or this referendum or this citizen initiative or whatever? So they're also focused on those inputs and how they can change how the government works and what the government does and the decisions that the government makes. One of the kind of perfect real world situations that we can use to kind of understand this different concept of political culture was the COVID pandemic that started back in 2020. There were lots of cultures, both within the United States and kind of internationally, that reacted very differently, both from a government perspective and from an individual perspective, when it came to that pandemic, right? One of the common policies that were passed in many areas, both of the United States and the world were things like mask mandates and lockdowns, right? And in some cultures, again, whether we're talking internationally or here within the United States, in some cultures, the focus was on kind of group safety, right? So they wore the masks, they abided by the lockdowns, they worked really hard to make sure that their lives were modified either based on the scientific reasoning or the government mandate or whatever, and focused on the group and what was best for the group. Whereas other cultures, both here in the United States and internationally, focused on individual rights. And they said, we don't have to do that. We're not going to wear masks. We're not going to abide by this lockdown. We're going to go out if we want to. We're going to not wear a mask if we don't have to. And very much focused on their individual rights and what the government should or shouldn't do when it comes to them as individuals, rather than thinking about the people around them and the group and what was best for everybody. They were primarily focused on what they wanted rather than what was best for the group. So that's a big kind of recent and famous example that really illustrates this divide in political culture and how people see government and how people see laws and how people see regulations, and how people react to governments passing new or different policies. A few other things we should think about when talking about political culture are socioeconomic conditions, right? The term socioeconomic is a conglomeration of social and economic because those two are so inextricably linked, right? The social and the economic are very, very difficult to really pry apart from each other. So most political scientists, criminal justice practitioners, social scientists in general, tend to just shove them together because they're so closely related as to be essentially one thing anyway. This socioeconomic condition and socioeconomic status can have a lot of influence on political culture, right? So it is very often when a conflict arises between two groups that one group has lots of socioeconomic power and the other group doesn't. We can talk about this in terms of crime. We can talk about it in terms of welfare spending. We can talk about it in terms of all kinds of things. But very often, when two groups are opposed on a subject, one has lots of socioeconomic power, one of them doesn't. It's much more likely that the group without socioeconomic power is going to seek government intervention to come in and help with the problem, to come in and make a new policy, a new regulation, a new something, because they need that power of government to enforce their point of view on the larger, more powerful group. The larger, more powerful group, if there were no government intervention, would almost always get their way just because they have more socioeconomic status and power and capital. This is especially important at the state level, where groups with power are allowed to affect or are able to affect state governments much more so than they are able to affect the national government. Another thing we have to talk about when it comes to political culture is social change, right? Societies and peoples go through lots of social change over time. Especially over the 20th century, there was lots and lots and lots of social change that took place between 1900 and 2000. This is just a few examples of how the political culture has changed based not on new laws or new policies, but how society changed, and that really drove the new laws and policies. It wasn't the policies changing the people, it was the people and the kind of views of the people changing over time that drove government to function differently and new policies or modified policies to be passed. So there was the civil rights movement, where we got the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act in the mid 60s, which did a lot for, it was the changing views about race among the people that really drove that complete change in political culture and thus a change in policy. The women's rights movement, same thing. Women in this country didn't get the right to vote until 1920, right? And then, of course, they had to fight for more rights and more rights. And, of course, the civil rights movement and the women's rights movements, they're still going. There's still lots of inequalities there that they're still fighting for. But it is a much different political culture today than it was, say, in 1900 or 1910 or even 1950, right? The war on drugs is another one that was vastly shaped how the political culture has viewed drugs. There was the whole reefer madness in the 50s and the war on drugs. And Just Say No and DARE education and all those things. And that has vastly changed here in the 21st century. Now, especially when it comes to marijuana, this is seen as something we shouldn't be spending money on. This is seen as something that's not this horrible, dangerous drug that's going to kill people. And even with the horrible, dangerous drugs that will kill people, like heroin and cocaine and major drugs like that, we're seeing it not as something to fight a war on, not something that we need to involve law enforcement as much in, but take some of that focus on law enforcement and put it into things like treatment and rehab programs and such. So that social change has vastly changed the political culture. But maybe the biggest ever kind of single thing to change political culture in the United States is social media. And of course, this is still an ongoing process, so, ask me again in 20 or 30 years. But social media so far has vastly changed our political culture here in the United States and indeed around the world. Social media has given more access to political content and political persuasion, and it's created more bubbles and more kind of a confirmation bias, and all those things have been so vastly affected. It affects whether people vote and engage with government and how they vote and engage with government and how messaging is done. So social media has resulted in rapid and huge amounts of social change and thus political culture change and thus how politics works and how laws and policies and such are passed. All right, we're going to go ahead and take another break. Thank you so much.